This is Lecture 57D in the series The ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2018. And our topic in this particular lecture is the formation of the Vietnamese Communist Party. Now, Canton, or Guangzhou as it's named today, China in 1925, is the formation place and origin date of today's Communist Party of Vietnam, CPV, from here on in. Ho Chi Minh had arrived in Canton from Moscow in December 1924. In 1925, Ho kicked off the Vietnamese Revolutionary Youth Association, VRYA. And that's how the Vietnamese Communist Party dates its origin, from that particular group. The full name of the VRYA in Vietnamese is simply, is simply referred to as Ton Yen. Now, we want to go to the Congress of the Peoples of the East, which was held in March 1918, and as we have seen in previous volumes, V.I. Lenin established the Communist International at its founding Congress in Moscow. The Second Comintern Congress was held in Moscow in July and August of 1920 as the Red Army was approaching Warsaw. For our purposes in this chapter, I want to bring your attention to the fact that attending was a contingent of delegates from Asia. In a sidebar conference, they authorized the convocation of a special Congress of the Peoples of the East to be held under the Comintern's banner. Now, following Leninist thought, they wanted to instrumentalize the Comintern's leadership and impose clarity on the helter-skelter disarray in the colonial liberation movements. They were experimenting with a mechanism for the shattering of colonial empires. In theory, if imperialist markets were removed for the big capitalist countries, the resulting destabilization would give foreign Bolsheviks the space they needed to overthrow cap regimes in Asia. Now, revolutionary sentiment was already strong in the nations bordering Soviet Russia. In fact, it was strong throughout the colonial world, which is to say Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The written call for the Congress of the Peoples of the East came in July 1920 issue of Communist International, the official monthly magazine of the Comintern. It was signed by Comintern President Grigory Zinoviev and 25 Western Europeans and U.S. members of the Comintern Executive Committee. The place was Baku, and the date eventually selected was September 1st, 1920. A hospitality committee was formed in Baku to make all necessary arrangements. Transportation to the Congress was not as easy. Delegates traveling together from Moscow following the conclusion of the Second Comintern Congress had the use of an armored train. The movie Reds illustrates one ambush of that train returning to Moscow as the train passed through white terrorist territory. Also, Soviet Russia was subjected to a French-UK military blockade that they called the Cordon Sanitaire, and the government of Great Britain was doing its best to impede travel to oil-rich Baku. 2 delegates were killed and several wounded when a ship traveling to Baku from Iran was attacked by British warplanes. Additionally, British ships patrolled the Black Sea, making travel from Turkey a risky affair. The still undefeated reactionary governments of Armenia and Georgia banned attendance at the Congress, so delegates had to use stealth at border crossings from these countries. Anyway, 1,900 delegates succeeded in making their way to Baku for the convocation of the Congress of the Peoples of the East on September 1st, 1920. The gathering was by far the largest assembly of delegates organized by the Comintern to that date. Nearly 1,300 of the 1,891 delegates attending the Baku Congress registered as communists, coming from the Bolshevik groups in Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, and minority areas within the Soviet Republic. Nearly 400 others were not veteran Marxist revolutionaries but anti-colonial fighters working their way to Bolshevism. Obviously, the situation in the colonial world was that industrialization was minimal in the colonial nations, as was the trade union movement. The national bourgeoisie in those countries was very weak and largely comprador. At any rate, the Congress of the Peoples of the East took place in 7 sessions over an 8-day period. The Azerbaijani Bolshevik Nariman Narimanov called the first session to order at 9:40 p.m. on the night of September 1st, 1920. Comintern President Grigory Zinoviev was elected chairman of the Congress, and attending were all top Bolshevik leaders from Lenin on down, and they were made honorary chairman. A further 10 members were placed on the organizing committee, and these included John Reed from the USA, Tom Quelch of Great Britain, Alfred Rosmer, a Frenchman, Karl Radek from Russia, Karl Steinhardt from Austria. Of special importance was Joseph Stalin, a Georgian, the top Bolshevik expert on the national question, and the Soviet People's Commissar for Nationalities. Now, Zinoviev gave the keynote speech, and among other things, this notorious windsock declared the Baku Congress to be the second half of the Second Comintern Congress that recently finished its work in Moscow. The peasants of the entire East, under the wise leadership of the organized workers in the West, will now be able to rise up in their hundreds of millions, he said, in order to carry out a real, thoroughgoing agrarian revolution. They will be able to clear the soil so that no large landowners are left, no debt slavery, no taxes, dues, or any other variety of the devices used by the rich are left, and the land passes into the hands of the laboring masses." Unquote. Zinoviev declared that the Second World Congress had determined that it would not be necessary for the nations of the East to have passed through the state of capitalism before embarking upon socialist revolution. The nations of China, India, Persia, that is Iran, Turkey, and Armenia were explicitly singled out by Zinoviev as ripe for proletarian revolution in his keynote address. Zinoviev chaired the following night's session dedicated to the international political situation. The main speaker was Karl Radek. Now, Radek said the principal current enemies of the peoples of the East were the British, German, and French empires. The delegates knew one cause of World War I was the struggle of these imperialist powers for markets in the Arabia and the Far East. The enormous cost of this war in money and lives had severely weakened all of these capitalist powers, winners and losers alike. The third session lasted 3 hours and was held in the early afternoon of September 3rd and dealt largely with the situation in Turkestan. The fourth session convened that same evening and heard a series of speakers, including the reading of a substantial written statement by Enver Pasha of Turkey. Now, this session broke up into violent confrontations between the partisans involved in Turkey and the adjoining countries. It seemed as if any kind of unity, such as the organizers of the Congress had hoped for, was impossible for the moment. What did this portend? Well, Session 5 was held during the night of September 5th, 1920, and dealt with the questions of nationalism and colonialism, with the discussion based upon a lengthy speech delivered to the gathering by Michael Pavlovich, a Bolshevik official in the People's Commissariat of Foreign Affairs. Now, Pavlovich said the removal of Russia from the imperialist camp meant the modern imperialist rivalry in the East was a conflict between the empires of Germany, Great Britain, and France, and now the United States and Japan. At the sixth session, during the night of September 6th, it featured the legendary Hungarian Bolshevik Bela Kun, delivering his theses on Soviet power in the East. He said even after the rule of the foreign imperialists had been eliminated, the revolution of the toiling masses of the East will not come to a halt. It will move past rule by national bourgeoisie to complete liberation from imperialist exploitation through transfer of the land to the Toilers and removal from power of the non-working element, all foreign colonialist elements, and all privileged persons. Now, the delegates greeted this with a stormy applause. A final seventh session held the night of September 7th, 1920, established a permanent executive body called Council for Propaganda and Action of the Peoples of the East. This body was to convene additional congresses of the people of the East no less frequently than once a year, and to conduct day-to-day work in the interval between congresses. Now, however, as it turned out, Lenin and his Politburo hashed out the lessons of the Congress, especially in light of the fourth session debacle, and decided that the Cheka could best handle the organization of revolution in East Asia. Cheka was the Bolshevik secret police that Lenin called the sword and shield of the proletarian revolution and those are Russian initials in short for the Extraordinary Commission for the Suppression of Counter-Revolution, Speculation, and Sabotage. At any rate, to take on this additional role, the Chica would have to expand its scope with a professional staff of experts on the history and contemporary politics of many parts of the world, and it would have to develop a corps of professional analysts to keep the Politburo and the Central Committee informed. At any rate, as far as the idea of additional congresses of the peoples of the East was concerned, there was only one subsequent congress, and that was the conference called the Toilers of the East that convened in Moscow in January and February 1922. Nevertheless, the Congress of the Peoples of the East was the first of the 20th century congresses of a broad front nature that would be created by communists, and as the respective communist parties in and out of power developed their own chicas, it would be easier to give clear direction to such mass organizations. J.V. Stalin had been in charge of all Bolshevik intelligence organizations historically. Soon after this decision by the RCP Politburo, he was given the additional responsibility of transforming these organs. They were now to pursue the internationalist objective of the People's Congress of the East, as well as the Comintern proper. The time has come in early 1924. V.I. Lenin told J.V. Stalin to send Ho Chi Minh to Vietnam more or less at the same time with Michael Borodin. Now, I have discussed the mission of Borodin and Blücher in Volume 1 in the chapters Bolshevism Spreads to China. Ho would use Canton to organize his political base, the Heart-to-Heart Association, NHA. That organization would then lead the fight to end Vietnam's colonial occupation by France. HHA was a broad group that would seek the political and social objectives of national independence and the redistribution of land to working peasants. In Canton, Ho became a secretary and interpreter to Lenin's James Bond, Michael Borodin, who had also just arrived. Among his tasks was getting his Vietnamese, that is among Ho's tasks, was getting his Vietnamese patriotic movement, the Heart-to-Heart Association, ready for war. In the course of doing that, he was converting a small group of émigré intellectuals to revolutionary socialism. HHA was an open membership mass organization. Its center was the Communist Youth Corps, CYC. This inner circle directed two other mass organizations, the Nong Hoi Peasants Association and the Kong Hoi Workers Association. Now, in 1925, the CPV headquarters was in Canton, that is Guangzhou, China. From there, the party leaders directed the underground revolutionary movement in Vietnam. The CPV was designed to prepare for an armed struggle against the French colonial occupation. Ho Chi Minh and his associates envisioned that preparation and armed struggle would develop through phases. In the first phase, an external center was established in Canton, that is Guangzhou, as a training center, source of unified political propaganda, and headquarters for strategic decision-making, and the maintenance of organizational and ideological discipline. Secret revolutionary cells were trained in Canton and then returned to Vietnam. In the second and in-country phase, activity would be semi-secret. Heart-to-heart cadres would initiate industrial actions, boycotts, and protests, mobilizing the masses. And the third phase was insurrection. It would feature an armed uprising, and this phase was deemed to have succeeded when the French regime and the party established a popular government. When the French regime was overthrown, I should say, and the party established a popular government. Now, from 1925 to May 1930, the Canton-based CPV and CYC published monographs, published pamphlets, and newspapers. Among them, a guidebook of revolutionary theory and practical techniques called The Road to Revolution, as well as 4 newspapers. Tan Nhân Youth was issued from December 26 to February 1928, and the Bao Kong Nong, or Worker Peasant, was also printed, and another called Revolutionary Soldier, from early 1927 to early 1928, and Vietnam, the Vanguard of Vietnam, was published in 1927. Now, taking a closer look at Ho Chi Minh. In 1890, Ho Chi Minh was born in his mother's village of Quang Tru. After 1895, he grew up in his father's village of Lang Sen in Nghe An province. He had a traditional name at that time, and he had 3 siblings: a sister, Bak Lien, who became a clerk in the French army, a brother, Nguyen Sin Kiem, who became a traveling shaman and traditional herbalist, and another brother who died in his infancy. As a young child, Ho studied with his father before being enrolled in formal classes with a scholar named Bong Tuk Do. Ho quickly mastered Chinese writing, a prerequisite for the study of Confucianism, while honing his colloquial Vietnamese writing. He dreamed of great adventures, loved flying kites and fishing. At the age of 10, his father gave him a new name, Nguyen the Accomplished. In 1925, he would get the name of Ho Chi Minh and would use it exclusively, more or less, after 1939. His father was a Confucian scholar and teacher, and later an imperial magistrate in the small remote district of Bien Ke. He was demoted for abuse of power after an influential local figure died several days after having received 102 strokes of the cane as punishment for an infraction. However, Ho's father was eligible to serve in the imperial bureaucracy. He refused because it meant serving the French. This exposed Ho to rebellion at a young age and seemed to be the norm for the province where he came of age. The province was known for its resistance to foreign rule. In deference to his father, Ho received a French education, attended lycée in Hue. That French school was the alma mater of his later disciple Pham Van Dong and General Vo Nguyen Giap. Seeing the world. In May 1908, Ho was involved in the anti-slavery demonstrations in Hue. Ho later said the 1908 revolt had been the moment when his revolutionary outlook emerged. And anyway, he left school to go abroad in 1911. Ho worked as a kitchen helper on a French steamer called the Amirale de la Touche-Treville while using an alias. The steamer departed on the 5th of June 1911 and arrived in Marseille, France on July 5th, 1911. The ship then left for Le Havre and Dunkirk, returning to Marseille in September 1911. In Marseille, he applied for the French Colonial Administrative School, but his application was rejected. He then decided to travel the world by working on ships and visited many countries, and he did that between 1911 and 1917. In 1912, while working as the ship's cook's helper, Ho traveled to Gringolandia. From 1912 to 1913, he lived in Harlem and Boston, working there as a baker at the Parker House Hotel. Among a series of menial jobs, he worked for a wealthy family in Brooklyn between 1917 and 1918, and for General Motors as a line foreman. Between 1913 and 1919, Ho lived in England's West Ealing as a cook and dishwasher, and later in Crouch End, Hornsey. He trained as a pastry chef under Auguste Escoffier at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in the Haymarket, Westminster, and on the wall of that Ritz-Carlton Hotel there is a blue plaque stating that Ho Chi Minh worked there in 1913. Ho was also employed as a pastry boy on the New Haven-Dieppe ferry in 1913. Ho arrived in Paris from London in 1917, and from 1919 to 1923, while living in France, Ho got involved with the Socialist Party of France, and Ho joined a group of Vietnamese nationalists in Paris whose leaders were Pan Chu Trinh and Phan Von Trong. They were publishing newspaper articles advocating Vietnamese independence under the pseudonym Nguyen the Patriot. In 1919, the group petitioned for recognition of the civil rights of the Vietnamese people in French Indochina to the Western powers at the Versailles peace talks. Of course, they were ignored, as the Anglo-French imperialist gang had fought the war against the Kaiser's gang precisely to get their hands on as much of Germany's world empire as possible. Now, as a member of the petitioning group, Ho became a symbol of the anti-colonial movement at home in Vietnam. While the Congress of Victors at Versailles was underway, Ho was delivering speeches on the prospects of Bolshevism in Asia and attempting to persuade French socialists to join Vladimir Lenin's Third Communist International. In December 1920, Ho officially became a delegate to the Congress of Tours of the Socialist Party of France. At that Congress, he was a partisan for the Third International. He then became a founding member of the Communist Party of France, FCP. He was assigned to be the secretary for Vietnam in the Colonial Committee of the FCP, and during this period he wrote journal articles and short stories and directed his Vietnamese nationalist group. While in Paris, he had a romance with a dressmaker named Marie Briere, who arrived in Paris from London in 1917. In 1923, Ho left Paris for Moscow carrying a passport in the name of a Chinese merchant in the Soviet Republic. Ho met Lenin and Stalin, and they assigned him to the Comintern's secret department. Now, while in Moscow, he studied at the Communist University of the Toilers of the East and participated in the 5th Comintern Congress in June of 1924. After that Congress, Lenin told Stalin to send Ho back to Vietnam. Stalin did so, sending Ho to join with Michael Borodin's forces in Canton that would be his safe base for operations against the French dictatorship in Vietnam. Ho traveled under an alias to Canton, which is, I've said, is present-day Guangzhou. From 1925 to 1926, Ho organized youth education classes, giving socialist lectures to the Vietnamese revolutionary young people at the Whampoa Military Academy. These young people would become the seeds of a new revolutionary communist movement in Vietnam. In Canton, he lived with and married a Chinese woman named Chi Minh on 18 October 1926. She was 21 and he was 36. They married in the same place where Zhou Enlai had married earlier, and then they took up post-marital residence in the home of Michael Borodin, the Comintern's James Bond. Chiang Kai-shek's 1927 anti-communist Green Gang fascist coup triggered a new era of exile for Ho. Ho left Canton again in April 27 and returned to Moscow, spending some of the summer of 1927 recuperating from tuberculosis in the Crimea. Ho returned to Paris once more in November 1927. He then returned to Asia by way of Brussels, Berlin, Switzerland, and Italy. From Italy, he sailed to Bangkok, Thailand, arriving in July 1928. He served as the senior agent for Comintern activities in all of Southeast Asia. Ho remained in Thailand over a year, staying in the village of Nay Chok until late 1929. Then he moved on to India and then Shanghai, China. He was doing his best to disguise his identity from KMT, that's Chiang Kai-shek's secret police, and MI6. In early 1930 in Hong Kong, Ho chaired a meeting with representatives of the two Vietnamese Communist parties that emerged from Chiang's April 1927 deadly coup. He was able to merge them into a reunified Communist Party of Vietnam. In June of 1931, Ho was arrested in Hong Kong. But because of his careful maneuvering, MI6 was unsure of his identity. The French were not in the mood to take any chances and demanded this man's extradition. Bribes were paid to the cops in Hong Kong so they could say they were simply attempting to reduce French pressure for extradition when it was announced in 1932 that Ho had died. Of course he hadn't, but that was part of the story that the cops made up. The Hong Kong British released Ho under his alias in January 1933, and he got the hell out of town. His escape to the Soviet Union had been arranged by the Chika's Foreign Operations Directorate. Ho was in the Soviet Union for over 5 years. In Moscow, he studied and taught at the Lenin Institute while being secretly trained in clandestine work by the Chika. In 1938, Ho was sent to Yan'an, China to join Mao's new base area. There he was to organize his armed contingent that would enter Vietnam as soon as possible with the assistance of the Chinese Red Army. By 1940, Ho began regularly using the name Ho Chi Minh. Now was also the time to kick off the long-prepared war for state power in his home country. Stalin's intelligence service had learned that a Japanese attack on Indochina was now just a matter of time. Since the Soviet Red Army had just destroyed the Japanese attack on Mongolia and the USSR at Khalkhin Gol in September of 1939. Now, the Japanese General Staff had decided instead of their imperialist northern strategy, they would launch their imperialist southern strategy and give up on Siberia. This meant that French control of Indochina would be severely challenged and immediately, and also that the opportunity for Bolshevik victory had never been greater. So it was on. The anti-imperialist wars in Vietnam, communists defeat France, Japan, and the USA. Now, as we have seen, the Vietnamese Communist Party traces its lineage back to 1925, when Ho Chi Minh established the Vietnamese Revolutionary Youth League, commonly referred to as Thanh Nien. Thanh Nien was a communist youth organization open to all that wanted to end the colonial occupation of the country by France. The group sought the political and social objectives of national independence and the redistribution of land to working peasants. Thanh Nien prepared the ground for the revolutionary armed struggle against the French occupation. In 1928, the headquarters of Thanh Nien organization in Canton was forced back into Vietnam and underground by the Chinese fascist Kuomintang, KMT. It had taken the gangland chief Chiang Kai-shek 9 months to battle through to Sun Yat-sen's capital. For his part, Ho Chi Minh had gotten out of China as soon as the April fascist coup began in Shanghai. On its way home, the National Central Committee of the Thanh Nien organization split. Now, on June 17, 1929, more than 20 delegates from cells throughout the Tonkin region held a conference in Hanoi. There they declared the dissolution of Thanh Nien and the establishment of a new organization they called the Communist Party of Indochina, ICP. The other faction of Thanh Nien, based in the central and southern administrative districts of the country, renamed themselves the Communist Party of Annam in late 1929, which is the central part of Vietnam. The two organizations spent the rest of 1929 engaged in polemics against one another in an attempt to gain a position of hegemony over the radical Vietnamese liberation movement. A third Vietnamese Communist Party emerged around this time called the League of the Indo-Chinese Communists, which was not connected with Thanh Nien. The League had existed in parallel with Thanh Nien and saw itself as a rival to the latter. So that's what Ho Chi Minh had to confront with regard to reunification. Now, at any rate, the Vietnamese Communist Party was founded on 3 February 1930 by uniting the Communist Party of Indochina in Tonkin, the Communist Party of Annam in Cochin China, and therefore the Communist League of Indochina in Central Annam joined the Vietnamese, or thereafter I should say, the Communist League of Indochina in Central Annam joined the Vietnamese Communist Party, and it adopted a new name. The Comintern, however, had argued that the communist movement should be promoted in the whole of French Indochina, including Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, rather than only in Vietnam. Therefore, it urged the Vietnamese Communist Party to transform itself into the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, and therefore a change was made in its name accordingly. Now, in summary, from 3 to 7 February 1930 in Hong Kong, the two warring splinters of Thanh Nien joined with individual members of a third Marxist group called the Communist Party of Vietnam, the latter founded by Phan Bo Chow. All three now held their unification conference, and after a review by the Comintern in Moscow and its secret department chief Joseph Stalin, the Comintern had issued its official directive. The Communist Party of Vietnam was renamed the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, and during its first 5 years of existence, the ICP built a full membership of 1,500 with 15,000 candidate members and a vastly greater number of sympathizers. Now, the ICP was by far the most important political party in Vietnam and Laos. Terrible harvests in 1929 and 1930, piled on top of the oppressive landlord-imposed debt, radicalized the common farmers. The ICP finally had the in-country space it had been fighting for, and launched May Day demonstrations in the industrial city of Vinh. The idea was that the May Day demonstrations would expand until the families of the workers who still lived in the villages would join the demonstrations. This joint expression of dissatisfaction with their economic oppression would then be the platform upon which to build the insurrectional army. In 1930, 3 different May Day marches grew into mass rallies. The French colonial regime moved to quash what they knew would become a dangerous peasant revolt. Government forces fired upon the assembled crowds. The thugs murdered dozens of participants, inflaming the population. The ICP moved to get local councils organized in villages that would govern themselves locally. This, of course, was a first move to take state power, and state power is something the capitalists, foreign or domestic, can never compromise on. It was a shot heard worldwide. There was a bloodbath and then rebuilding. In the fall of 1931, suppression of the working and farming peoples by the colonial regime began, and about 1,300 people were killed by the French. Many more were imprisoned or deported by the now openly fascist colonial government. The ICP was driven underground, but that was nothing new. ICP General Secretary Tran Phu and many members of the Central Committee were seized by the police and killed. Now, the Popular Front from 1935 to 1939. In 1935, the first National Party Congress was held in secret in Macau. At the same time, a Comintern Congress in Moscow adopted a policy of Popular Front against fascism. It directed communist parties around the world to collaborate with anti-fascist forces. This required the ICP, that Indo-Chinese Communist Party, to regard all anti-French parties in Indochina as potential allies. In 1935, Lei Hongfeng was assigned by the Communist International to rebuild the mass movement. Lei Hongfeng was elected as the ICP General Secretary. In 1936, Ha Hui Tap was appointed General Secretary, and Lei Hongfeng was sent to the country to restore the Central Committee. In June 1940, the French fascists sold out their country to Hitler, creating the traitor regime of collaborators in Vichy France. Thus, French colonial war against the communists and Viet Minh in Indochina was impossible. The Japanese fascists took up the slack, and Japanese forces occupied Indochina. As the French ruling oligarchy joined the Hitlerites, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party instructed its members to go into hiding in the countryside. Even so, more than 2,000 party leaders and members were rounded up and killed. Party activists were particularly hard hit in the southern region of Vietnam. Now we come to the section that I call the Return of the Boss. In February 1941, party leader Ho Chi Minh returned to Vietnam. He took the situation in hand and began to recover what he could from what had been built before the fascist takeover of the French Republic. After the 1940 uprising in southern Vietnam, most of the Central Committee leaders, including Nguyen Van Cu, the General Secretary, and Ha Hui Tap, had been arrested and killed, and Lei Hongfeng deported to his death at Con Dao. Ho Chi Minh built a new party leadership because he had no choice, which included Trong Chin, Pham Van Dong, and Vo Nguyen Giap. These four emerged to provide a unified leadership over the next 4 decades. Together they built a military organization known as the League for the Independence of Vietnam, commonly referred to as Viet Minh. The Viet Minh was the uncompromising fighting force against the Japanese occupation. Accordingly, it gained popular recognition and legitimacy in the otherwise treasonous French environment. From 1941 until 1944, Ho Chi Minh's personal fate was not an easy one. With his organization underarmed and its bases isolated, Ho traveled to China in August 1942 seeking Allied military aid. Ho was arrested by Chiang's fascist government and subjected to 14 months of brutal imprisonment, followed by another year of restricted movement. Ho was unable to return to Vietnam again until September 1944. The Communist Party and the Viet Minh, however, fought on without him in Vietnam, of course. Now, independence from France in August 1945, when Japan had surrendered its troops in Vietnam, went into their barracks. The Japanese troops did. Then a revolution was organized by the Viet Minh. It launched an uprising that freed Le Duan and other party faithful. A seizure of state power had been quick and thorough. Ho became chairman of the provisional government, premier of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and issued the Declaration of Independence. He convinced the puppet Emperor Baodet that the better part of his valor would be to abdicate. His government was not recognized by any country at any rate, and his head was already in the noose. So Ho repeatedly petitioned U.S. President Harry S. Truman for support for Vietnamese independence, citing the Atlantic Charter, but Truman did not respond. Ho did not know what Joseph Stalin knew, and that was that the good old days of communist alliance with progressive gringoism against fascism were over. After the successful takeover of Hanoi, the U.S. airlifted fascist Chinese and French forces into Vietnam. The Communist Party formally dissolved itself, sending its cadre into the Viet Minh. The DRV government needed to be restored, and it was the task of the Broad Front to see that that was done. Thus, communists were to show the way, becoming primarily members of a larger struggle for independence. Of course, the ICP Corps was still functioning, and party membership grew to about 400,000 members by 1950. In 1951, during the War for Independence, the Communist Party was officially reestablished and renamed the Workers' Party of Vietnam. The Indo-Chinese War against French forces lasted until 1954, when the French were served their frog legs at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And we will take that subject up in the next lecture.